Good morning, Robin. It's good to speak to you again.
Hello, Andy. Good to speak to you too.
I hope you're well, sir. I hope you're well. Thank you very much again for giving your time to input into the Democracy Commission. We're enormously grateful. As you might know, the sort of context to Kirklees Council setting up the Democracy Commission is in many ways driven by what's happening in the terms of constitutional reform across the United Kingdom, and particularly regional devolution in England, and in many ways the oversight of central government to the implications for local government in many contexts. But I think the wider sort of framework is in many ways linked to what happened this summer with the European Union referendum, and that general concern about citizen engagement with local democracy and the changing role of councillors within that. So, your expertise is genuinely valued, and I think one of the things that we are very keen to hear about, which your presentation will no doubt give us an overview of, is the fact that this isn't a conversation which is unique to the United Kingdom or to England, that questions around devolution are affecting many democracies across the world. And it would be good if you could start off by giving us a brief overview of your presentation.
Fine, okay, Andy. Well, first of all, can I say thank you for inviting me to contribute to your work. Can I congratulate you all on organising this commission? It's certainly the right thing to be doing, and it really is very well timed given the changes that you mentioned. And I also think that the terms of reference that you've set yourselves are really good. So all power to your efforts. I think it's very important. In terms of the presentation, if it's okay, I think the main thing is for me to respond to your questions and try and help address issues that you were interested in. But if I could just set the scene with this little presentation that I gave to the Local Government Association conference in Bournemouth in July, because I think it happens to fit quite well with your interests. If I just... have you got the PowerPoint or print of it available?
We have indeed, yes.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go through this laboriously, Andy. That's not a good idea. But if I just skip through some of the main points, and then we can open up and go to Q&A.
That's wonderful.
So starting off there, that's a nice photograph of Bristol. That's an aerial view of my city where I am now. We did introduce a directly elected mayor to our city in 2012. That was a big new step for the unitary authority to take. And we've done some research, sort of before and after research, on what difference having a mayor in Bristol has made. So I could talk a bit about that later if that's helpful.
Yes, that would be very helpful.
So there's some work on mayoral changes in Bristol. I've got a book out there that's about leading the inclusive city, which is a more international study of city leadership in different countries. Perhaps we could draw on that. But I think the third slide is the one that's perhaps most relevant to the devolution debate. That's just the cover of the report that the LGA has now put on the Devo Next website. That I must say I worked very closely with the LGA on doing this work, so I want to acknowledge the real good help I've got from them. It was actually the City Regions Board, chaired by Sir Richard Leith, who invited me to take on this study, and I worked with them in developing the report, so it's a bit of a collective effort. The next slide is the devolution timeline. I think you're all familiar with this, but it does really start back with in 2009 with the last Labour government coming forward with the idea of combined authorities. That was really the start of these changes. Then, as you know, we've had the coalition government moving forward with different steps, particularly the Heseltine review. Then the referendum in Scotland, I think, pushed the devolution agenda forward quite quickly because of concerns about change in Scotland being out of kilter with England. And then, as you all know, since the election in May 15, the Conservative government has pushed ahead with the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act. And you're obviously very involved in reshaping the city region governance in your the world. I think the LGA wanted really to try and widen the conversation about subnational governance. I think the view was, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth here, but I think there was a view that the government was really stuck on one idea about how to govern city regions, that is, with a directly elected mayor for the city region, and that it really might make sense to just be a bit more open-minded about other options. So in the brief for the study, they wanted to see some good examples of mayoral leadership, but also some examples where there was no directly elected mayor. So that was the background. I think for the Commission in Kirklees, the next slide, the principles of good governance, might only be the most useful, because it really links in quite closely with your terms of reference and ideas. So
yes.
With the City Regions Board, we came up with 6 criteria that we thought a good subnational governance arrangement should deliver. So you can see them there, and they're in more detail in the report. Civic leadership, effective decision making, transparency and efficiency, accountability, public involvement and business engagement. And then in the study, I report on 4 examples, I'll do them very quickly in a minute, of good, I think pretty good subnational governance. And they're each evaluated against those 6 criteria. So there's just like a description. It's an attempt to say what's good, what's perhaps not so good about each model. Is it okay if I just skip through the 4? Just
that would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Then come back to questions?
Yeah, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, I'll just go. I'm not going to go in detail, but the first 2 examples, Auckland Council and the Greater London Authority, those are both models with a directly elected mayor, but they're actually very different. And I think that's one of the things to debate about mayors. There's not one fixed model. There's actually a great variety across the world of mayoral models. The Auckland example is pretty radical. I've included it at one end of the extreme, where you just merge authorities together into one really big unitary, and that's what they did. I think it was 8 councils were governing Auckland, and in 2010 they merged them into one big unitary council with a directly elected mayor, and then with what they call local boards within Auckland, 21, to involve citizens in local decision making. So if you think that would be like Greater Leeds, is one massive unitary with local boards within it. That's what they did in Auckland. It's a little bit of a radical one and may not appeal to local authorities in England, but it is an option. The second one is the Greater London Authority. This is more familiar, of course, because it's our own UK model, introduced in 2000, where I think this model is highly respected around the world. It's worth saying that, because you've got a strategic authority for the whole of Greater London. You have a directly elected mayor, but you also have constituency members and London members. You have an assembly that holds the mayor to account. Meanwhile, the London boroughs continue to run most of the local government services, as I'm sure you all know. So there's two directly elected mayor models. The next 2, just quickly, have not got directly elected mayors, but they are really good models of subnational governance. Portland Metro is in Oregon, where here voters elect 3 kinds of people. They have a president, they have constituency councillors, and that forms the strategic governance level. This is a bit like the GLA. It's above the level of the municipalities. I think there are 28 below the metro. So they're carrying on delivering local services, but the strategic authority, the metro, has elected politicians. It also has an elected auditor. It's like an elected scrutiny chief to hold the president and the councillors to account. So I think the model works well. The president does not have executive power. This is not a directly elected mayor. The president has to work in a very collective way with other councillors. So the president has power, can appoint people to different roles, but it's a more collegial model than a mayoral model. And I think Portland is particularly good at public engagement, and I know you're interested in that in the Commission. And it's on their website, and I've recommended this to a few different authorities, is that there's a public engagement guide that they've developed over some time that could be quite useful to look at for details of how they do that. The last one, the Association of the Region of Stuttgart in Germany, is another big city-region governance arrangement, and here, as you probably know, in Germany, they favour proportional representation. So the elected assembly is created by PR, and the councillors who are elected, I think there are 80, it's quite a large council, it's a very big area, but they then select their chair, rather like a conventional UK local authority, to be the chair of the region. Again, the municipalities continue to govern below the level of the city-region authority. So I've skipped through those quite quickly, and there's lots of other models, to be honest, but these are in the report just to illustrate some, I think, quite well-respected models of governance. So just to wrap up, the last slide then, as you can see, there are different models of subnational governance. There's no one model superior to others. I think they've got strengths and weaknesses. I think the headline in LGC when the report came out was something along the lines, you don't have to have a directly elected mayor, which was a bit of a simplification of the study, but to be fair, that is one of the key findings. There's different balance of power between executive and assembly, so there's lots of scope there for you in your devolved governance to deal with that. There are opportunities for citizen involvement. I've mentioned the Portland Public Engagement Guide. And I think you're onto this in the Commission. You need to include a variety of voices in civic leadership, and you need good scrutiny. So that's my whisk through the presentation. I hope I haven't gone through that too quickly, but it just might be useful. Now, of course, what's nice about the timing here, it's all written up, so the detail behind these models can be looked at in the report. But with that, I think I'll hand back to you, Andy, and I'm happy to take any questions either about the report or the mayoral model in Bristol or any issues at all.
Well, Robin, that's enormously helpful. Just to give you an idea about who else is in the room, I'm joined today by three of the commissioners drawn from the council, Kirklees Council itself, and I think they would like to introduce themselves first. Gemma, if you want to.
Okay, thank you.
Hi Robin, I'm Gemma Wilson, one of the councillors and member of the Democracy Commission. I was elected last year, so fairly new to the council still. Okay, thank you.
Andrew? Yeah, Andrew Marchington, also a Kirklees Council, member of the Commission, and I've been a councillor for about 12 years now.
Okay, thank you.
And Eric Firth from Dewsbury, a member of the Commission, and I've been elected member for... some people say too long, but it's 20 years, over 20 years now. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that.
We're also joined by various wonderful officers from Kirklees Council as well, who've been, as you quite rightly noted, very proactive in setting up the Commission and also in establishing the terms. And I think that the comments you made are ones that I've already made, that they are both timely in setting up the Commission and also in establishing appropriate terms for our inquiry. Just to start off and to think about your presentation and the different case studies you've undertaken, you mentioned the principles of good governance, those 6 principles that you identified.
Yes.
How important do you think each of these factors is when developing a regional governance model? And I'm thinking about that obviously in the context of what's happening in Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, Greater Yorkshire, Lesser Yorkshire, or whatever form of Yorkshire emerges as a combined authority.
I'm sorry, Andy, I didn't quite catch the question in that.
Oh, right.
Sorry.
I was just wondering if you'd like to just sort of talk through and just sort of discuss what you think, you've identified these important factors. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about each one in terms of developing an appropriate model of regional governance for West Yorkshire or for Yorkshire.
Yeah, absolutely, got it, thank you. I think just before, and I can say a little bit about each of the 6, that maybe the context again is worth emphasising. We do live in a very centralised state, and I want to really emphasise this. In my last job, I was working in Chicago. I was at the University of Illinois, the big public university in the middle of the big city region of Chicago. And I came back from working there in 2007. And this is just a bit of a personal remark, but I do remember being really quite deeply shocked about how centralised the UK state had become. I guess I thought it was centralised before I went in 2002. When I came back, I really did realise then, in a way that I hadn't realised before, it's absolutely remarkable the degree of control central government exercises over local government in the UK. But obviously we're talking about England. Let's talk about England today. It is extreme. There's no other country that I've worked with that does this, and I think it's holding the country back. And to be blunt, I think the efforts to bring about devolution do not go anywhere near far enough. I think we need a lot more power locally.
Can I just ask, Robin, on that point? Can I just ask on that point, because it's a well recognised point that England is over centralised. Why do you think that Westminster has been so reluctant to devolve power within England in the way that it has done in other parts of the United Kingdom?
Right. I think often these steps, these centralising steps. I used to work in local government, by the way, many happy years ago, from quite a few years. I think the steps towards centralisation are often very incremental, so individual central governments at different times. I'm going right back to Labour in the 70s, actually, and then through the Thatcher years, particularly the Thatcher years taking a lot of control. I think each individual step perhaps didn't appear to be that significant on its own, but if you keep piling on changes and removing powers, you weaken the whole democratic base of the country. Why it's different in the different parts of the UK really stems from political movements at the local level pressing for change. I think this is a story that could be quite positive. So the new Labour government in '97 realised that it really had to do something about the voices from Wales and Scotland. So they did. And the devolution to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly was really quite a radical effort to decentralise power. I think we should recognise Labour did make a major step there. But they didn't do much about England, as you know. And we've continued this creeping centralisation. So on a more optimistic note, I'm hoping that these new arrangements can provide local authorities with a platform for pushing for more power, and that over a period of time, and you mentioned the European Union referendum and the turbulence that we're now in, the optimistic view would be that we can really take some steps to speak to those concerns and use it to re-empower local authorities and obviously city regions. So that would be my general argument.
Thank you.
If I just go to the sixth then, I think the first one is the most important, the civic leadership. You might think, oh well, I would say that because particularly that's my area of work, is working on civic leadership. But leadership can develop the capacity of an area, develop a vision for the area, and can really, I think, foster and encourage and develop civic pride. I think we've understood it, and I think the idea of mayors is part of that discussion, but it doesn't have to be directly elected mayors. But I think you want a model of governance in your city region that does have strong, effective leadership. And then the other 5 criteria that come in really underpin good leadership. You can't just have good leadership without these other qualities, I think. So the effective decision making is about having sound arrangements for making decisions, and also for having adequate deliberative debate about the decisions. So it's not just about being a business-like corporation that does things. As you know, it's a democratic institution. And that takes you into the transparency, which is fundamental. And I am a little worried about the devolution deals that we've been witnessing around the country, because they've been really mainly been done behind closed doors with a lack of transparency. I've been quite critical of the government on that. I don't think that's a good idea, because I don't think it builds trust and confidence, really. On accountability, I think you heard me mention the models in the report. They do all have some direct election to that regional level, sub-regional level, which the current arrangements for combined authorities don't. It's all indirect, isn't it? So you'll have councillors from the constituent areas serving on the new combined authority. I'm not sure that's good enough for democratic accountability myself, but that's perhaps a debate to be had, that in the future we may need to go for direct election. Not necessarily like London, but as you know, the London Assembly members are held to account, and the mayor is held to account at the ballot box. That's two. Then public involvement. You do need to have strong arrangements for that, and I think your commission can break new ground here. I think there's a lot of experiment going on, but we need more. I think the idea of devolved governance to areas within the city region is important, because people are often more concerned about their immediate locality. I know the councillors in the room will know more about that than I do. The local community's interests are often focused on very specific issues, and that is important. Lastly, business engagement. When I worked in local government, we were not good at business engagement at all. In fact, it was neglected. We didn't really see it as important. I'm back in the 70s, early 80s, I guess. And that's changed a lot now. We do see some quite good practice, I think, in some of the local enterprise partnerships of speaking to and working with business interests. And there's a room to do more of that, and that's really important in the new arrangements, I think. It's something that's quite strong in Bristol, just going to my own experience here. I think that's improved quite a bit. So that's a quick run through those principles. I think there's more detail in the report for each one.
Now, that's enormously helpful. Thank you for that. I just want to go back to that point one, where you were talking about civic leadership, and quite rightly saying that it is the most important element of the principles of good governance. To what extent do you think that England has lacked that civic leadership in the way possibly that we've seen in other parts of the United Kingdom to push forward the devolution agenda?
Well, I think if you go right back, we can be very proud of the, if we go back to the origins of local government and the Victorian leaders in the big cities, and this includes all of the big northern cities, who were just remarkable people, the elected councillors, who changed the governance and the constitution of the country by asserting the importance of place. That's the way I would put it, and campaigning. Obviously, Chamberlain in Birmingham often gets mentioned in this context, but there were a lot of other great leaders. Then you have, and I think Michael Heseltine put it, I think he put this right, that from that heyday we've had I think he called it a century of centralisation. In other words, over quite a long time we've weakened local government. I think a century is probably not quite right, because local government gained power after World War II and the welfare state grew. So I think I think the centralisation has been more this last 25, 30 years. But I think I don't think we can criticize individuals here. I think there's been a shift where Whitehall has become more assertive in controlling what happens in localities in England, and it's been very effective at getting its own way, and I still think it is doing that through the devolution deals. So the challenge is quite big, I think, to try and reverse that trend. But we need to do it, and it may be that Brexit is a prompt to that even Whitehall realises it has to devolve more power to be successful.
So you think the failure, particularly in the northeast of England, is reflective of possibly a strengthening of that civic leadership outside of Whitehall?
I don't know the detail. I know the devolution deal in the northeast is in choppy waters, let's put it that way. I think some of the councils are not to join it, and some still want to go ahead. But as I understand it, they're really saying we're not getting, the ones who are opting out are saying, well, we're not really getting much out of this deal, and therefore we're not going to do it. And to be honest, I've looked a bit at the figures, certainly for Bristol. The sums coming through the devolution deals, compared with the cuts to local government spending, are astonishingly small. Chancellor Osborne was able to speak a lot about devolving power in these new budgets, but it's really trivial, the level of spending that's coming through that route compared with the cuts. And the government's managed to get that across to the media. I'm surprised it's not being exposed more.
Now that's an interesting point. I'm going to bring my fellow councillor after I've asked just one more question, which is around this notion of civic leadership, and particularly around the mayoral model. Now we know that the current government under Theresa May seems less enthused than David Cameron and George Osborne were about directly elected mayors.
Yes.
But I wonder whether you'd like to expand, looking on the basis of the case study work that you've done, on your views on the mayoral model, and give us some examples of where it's worked well or possibly even less well.
Fine, okay. I think the work we were able to do in Bristol is relevant to this. I say we, I'm at the University of the West of England, but I've worked with my colleague David Sweeting, who's a lecturer at the University of Bristol. So the two universities have worked together with the City Council and with the other interests in the city to do this study. And if I just simplify it, it is true that the individual you elect as mayor makes a difference on how the model performs. So that matters. We've tried to evaluate the model independent of who's actually the individual who's the mayor. It's not easy to do that, but I think you do have to acknowledge individuals can and should make a difference. The arguments in favour, and I think there's some quite good evidence in Bristol for this, is that the leadership of the city is visible. People now know who is the leader of the city in a way that's spectacularly different from before. Well, we've got survey data on this. And if you think that matters, and I think it probably does if you don't know who's leading, how do you hold them to account? That's quite a strong argument. I think the mayors, I've done work with mayors here in Britain but also abroad, I think the process of direct election gives those individuals a high level of legitimacy to do things, and it actually gives them a bit of confidence to take tough decisions that would be difficult if they were not directly elected. I think that's quite an important argument, and some councillors who've been both, like Sir Peter Soulsby, he's the Labour mayor of Leicester, as you probably know. Yeah. Peter was the leader of the council before, if you go back in time. So he can make a judgment about the difference of being a leader, and he was a strong leader as compared with being a directly elected mayor, and he's on record is chalk and cheese. Being a mayor, being directly elected gives you this authority to lead. I know a couple more points in favour, then I'll go on the against. You can have stable leadership if you have a 4-year term. I know in your terms of reference, if you're looking at electoral cycles and so on, I think it was a really good idea in Bristol to go for 4-year terms. Before we introduced a mayor, it was at 1/3 of the councillors each year and then a year off. So you've got this constant change, really, or potential change. Now we know the council will be elected in May this year. We've got a new Labour mayor, Marvin Rees, and Labour council for 4 years. And Marvin is working with a cabinet with members from different parties in the cabinet. That was an idea introduced by our last mayor, George Ferguson. So I think we kind of know who's going to run the place for 4 years. Then in 2016 there'll be another reflection, and we'll decide as citizens if we want that model, those people to carry on, or new people. Can I just go to the against, because I think there are some arguments against. And in the research in Bristol did show this. There is a risk that you concentrate too much power in the hands of one individual. That's, I think, the key argument against directly elected. It's also, in a way, one of its strengths. Yeah. But you can imagine if someone gets authority and then just decides, I'm going to do it my way, and doesn't listen much, that can be damaging, and you can get misguided policy. And I can think of a few examples in the US where that's the case. You can't get rid of them, 4 years or whatever it is.
The Boris Johnson effect.
I think there's an argument that the model encourages, I call it celebrities, to put themselves forward for political leadership.
Oh,
and that this might be a bad thing because you start focusing on the individual personalities of people rather than the policies they stand for. And there's one or two examples of that in different countries. I think there's a quite effective now who was a wrestler, for example. And I'm not saying people with different backgrounds can't be good leaders, but we need to be a bit careful with that. I think also, maybe going back to the earlier point, if you have a mayor in your city region, does that alter the local central relationship or not? Some people argue having a mayor isn't the key point. We need more power for our locality. And the Whitehall is still running things, even if you have a directly elected mayor. So those are my quick thoughts on the mayoral model and pros and cons.
Now that's enormously helpful. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to bring in Councillor Wilson.
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
Looking at the conversation we just had and your experience, obviously your fantastic academic and professional experience, which really is incredibly helpful to us, but also your experience as a citizen, actually living in a city where there is the mayor model.
Yeah.
What do you feel that the role of councillors within that model is? Do you feel that there's greater opportunities for councillors? Do you feel that councillors are perhaps losing power or perhaps losing a respect in that there's another layer that's brought in as well?
Yes, I can answer that very directly. And I don't want to particularly criticise individuals here, but we've had we had Mayor George Ferguson was the mayor, and he did not take too much time to work closely with councillors. I think he felt that the arrangements for governing the city needed to change, and the mayor needed to shake things up, and that had good things happening as a result. On the downside, and I've spoken to Mayor Ferguson about this, and it's in our report, many councillors became very frustrated that they were being excluded from decision making. So you're to raise that question, Councillor. We have now a new mayor, Marvin Rees, elected in May, who has a very different style of leadership. So you have somebody in the same office, the same power, the same positional power, but a much more inclusive approach to working with councillors. So I think my answer to the question there is a lot depends on the leadership style of the individual who is mayor, but it's also in the checks and balances that you design into the governance arrangement. So in Bristol, our mayor arrangements are under the Localism Act 2011, and that does give quite a lot of power, positional power anyway, to the mayor, not fiscal power, as you know, but that can be misused. So you might need to look at how to ensure councillors' voices are listened to by a mayor.
Thank you. And just wondered as well, what was your turnout like for the mayoral elections? I found that when I've been speaking to residents in my area, not that many people are massively interested in it, but it seems quite a negative response in that it just feels like another committee, another talking shop, another layer of governance that's set up. I just wondered if that was reflected, if people were actually engaged in the mayoral ideas and people were actually keen to be involved and saw a value.
Yeah, I can try and answer that one. I think a lot depends on the politics of the city, and it might be a bit difficult to generalise. But certainly when we had the first mayoral election in 2012, that was seen as quite exciting and different. So there were 15 candidates. I think we had more than for any other mayoral election. Obviously the main parties, but some really quite solid independent candidates, including Mayor Ferguson, who won. He does not belong to a party, but also some colourful characters making their own mark. So I think the campaign raised interest, and the annual lectures of the mayor, it was Mayor Ferguson, but it'll be the same for Mayor Rees, are very well attended. Over 600 people come to those meetings. It's the big civic hall in the University of Bristol, where it's the only building that can get everyone in. So in terms of the active citizenry, I think we've seen quite a high level of engagement with this new model. But you're quite right about the turnout. Our voter turnout in England, in local elections, is the worst in Europe. I slow down a little because we're very, very poor on the league tables. Everywhere's better than us. So there's something wrong here. And I go back to the centralisation of the state. I think we weakened local government so much that all local elections have got a low turnout now in England, relatively. So we have to be careful what we read, but I think the voter turnout in the May election this year for the mayor and the councillors, it was all on one day, I think it was 43%, which was an increase on the previous one.
Yeah,
so there's a tiny bit of evidence that voter turnout is going up a little bit, but I don't think mayor can drive up high voter turnout without having more powerful local government.
Thank you.
So they're not a panacea to the problems of local democracy turnout in themselves. There is a wider need for empowerment of the position, you think, to probably produce that greater public engagement.
Yeah, I think you can't. I think some people will rather hope, if we only have a directly elected mayor, then voter turnout will go up a lot and problems will be solved. That's not a good argument. It's much more complicated than that. But a good mayor can stimulate interest in new ways. Perhaps just on use of social media. This is a bit controversial, but Mayor Ferguson, well, I mentioned he did not work very well with his councillors. I think that was a mistake. But he was very good at getting out on the street, so he'd ride his bike and would be seen around the city a lot. He also used Twitter all the time. I don't know how many followers he had, but he became very effective in using social media to explain what he was doing, and I think that was quite attractive to some people. So there might be some options there for Kirklees ahead.
He was also sartorially very expressive as well. Yes. Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Robert. Looking at the relationship between in the different models you've looked at, between whatever the executive is, whether that's the mayor or the board or the council, and the local councils underneath, say the local boards or the municipal authorities, how does that play out? I mean, given the mayor needs to make strategic decisions, you've still got that still needs to link down to the local level, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Are you talking here about within Kirklees or about the city region?
Well, trying to look at what a future relationship might be, because again, you've got the example in Auckland. You've got the so the mayor and the council, but then you've got the local boards.
Yes.
You've still got the London boroughs. It's that relationship between the mayor and what potentially it might look in a West Yorkshire city region.
Right. Okay. We will. Well, if things stay as they are, we call it the West of England. I'm not sure it's a very good name, but this is the grouping of authorities call it Greater Bristol. We'll have a combined authority next May with a directly elected mayor for, call it a city region. So some people have said, surely this will be confusing. We've got a mayor for Bristol, and then we're going to have another mayor for, it's actually 3 unitary authorities. It's Bristol, South Gloucestershire, and Bath and North East Somerset. There'll be another mayor for that level, and is this going to be confusing to everyone? My answer to that is no, and I think citizens are quite able to distinguish the different roles up to a point. So in London, you have a Greater London mayor, Sadiq Khan now, and if you lived in, say, Lewisham, you'd be familiar with the directly elected mayor of Lewisham, that's Steve Bullock. So it's okay to have 2 lots of mayors, is what I'm saying. I think we've got that in London, and it's not. That's not a real. I don't think that's difficult at all. And good mayors work together. But going back to your point about the local boards, I think that is really important, and maybe Auckland is a good example because it's one big unitary. There were fears that the mayor and the cabinet around the mayor would become very distant from the localities within what's quite a big city. I think it's about 1.25 million population, so it's not an absolutely massive city, but it's pretty big. So the local boards, the 21 boards, have powers to make decisions relating to the local areas within Auckland that are those street level things that matter to local people, not devolved an enormous amount of power, but there is quite a bit that matters to local people around street maintenance, parks, community facilities, so on. But for Kirklees, that might be quite an important topic, because you've got quite in English local government, there's quite a lot of functions are run by Kirklees now, even with the spending cuts. So there might be new ideas for how control of those is shaped by local ward councillors. Some places have area committees and or community-based arrangements. And I think that could be, if you may be doing this already, forgive me if this is already in hand, but I think that will become even more important in a city region model. So if you're going to keep in touch with local people.
Thanks.
Just to sort of, Eric's going to come in, but just a quick question, Robin, on this role of the local councillor. Do you find that there is a difference in the way in which regional devolution has affected that role in what has emerged, such as Auckland, as a unitary framework, and then possibly other arrangements, such as in London or in Stuttgart, where you have a multi-level framework? Do you think that affects it? Thinking about it in the context that in England at the moment, it seems to be the government is preferring this multi-level approach towards regional devolution.
Yes, I suppose it could create more demands on councillors. I don't want to say it was very simple back in the day, but I think the governance structures were simpler and the responsibilities perhaps were a bit clearer. You represent your ward, you represent your party, you deal with your casework, you're an advocate for the place that elected you. I think we've seen some really good practice in different cities in England. I'll talk about England for a minute, and rural areas as well. Councillors are, some people talk about community catalysts. I think it's quite a nice phrase. The idea of the councillor being someone who's not just the representative on the council, but an activist who helps different organisations work together for the benefit of that small area that they're concerned with. So I can see that being a good thing and developing quite well in some places. Whether the new regional arrangements make that kind of action more difficult depends on how much power rests at the different levels. So maybe to go to London just for a moment, that was always seen, the Greater London Authority was always seen as a strategic authority, and it's really transport, spatial planning, strategic spatial planning and economic development laid on top of the London boroughs, with the London boroughs doing most of the really important public service work with education, social services, housing, planning and so on. And I think that's quite well in London. I think you've got people in Lambeth or Lewisham or wherever identify with their particular part of London, and much of the decision making that affects them in that area is locally based. So I think in your new city region you could take a little bit of comfort from what's happened in London. If there was a new when there is a strategic combined authority, if that can be strategic and not be trying to interfere in the details of how Kirklees is governed, it would be good.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you for that, Eric.
Thank you very much. You've given us much to think about. I've been scribbling like mad on my bits of paper. But as we're aware, we're looking at almost a new life for governance. But at the same time, government continues to emasculate local government by death by 1,000 cuts almost, by reducing what we can do with the limited amount of money that we have. And yet we're talking about devolution and granting lots of money and lots of powers to the new assembly. Well, we won't have an assembly in West Yorkshire because that's already been poo-pooed, I believe, by certain other leaders. It's been suggested, by the way, by Kirklees, and I don't think it's been welcomed, shall I say, by some other leaders. So at the moment, the West Yorkshire Combined Authority has 5 leaders from West Yorkshire plus York and some opposition members on there. but as you said, they've been sent there, if you like, by their own local authorities.
Right.
Do you think this model can continue, or will the public ultimately or eventually demand elections?
Well, I think you put your finger on something that really is of fundamental importance here, isn't it? I think elected leaders govern by consent, don't they? And if people start to feel that this is some distant, mysterious organisation that's not transparent and don't quite know who's doing what, that could be quite worrying. And I do want to mention there's a couple of reports come out from Parliament where different committees have looked at the arrangements being put together through Devo deals, and they've been very critical on exactly the argument you've made, that people do not understand who does what in the new combined authority arrangements, and the indirect election process might not be adequate for ensuring accountability for these new arrangements. So it's almost like, I do think this is a problem. It's almost like we're redesigning the constitution of the country without a proper debate about it. The deals are being done, and then there's a new combined authority that really have the legitimacy that it needs to exercise leadership for the city region. So I am concerned about that. So I'd encourage you to press on that. It might be you can't do much by Let's May. Let's assume your combined authority does start Let's May. Oh, by the way, I've suggested, I've written an article saying the whole process should be put back 1 year, and that we should have the elections to combined authorities in May 18. That was my suggestion. I've got no political power at all, but I just think we could think this all through and have a much better designed combined authorities if we did that. It might even be that does happen, because I think getting all the orders laid to enable the elections next May might be a struggle, just for practical reasons. But sorry, that's a long way of trying to answer your question. But I do think that you should be thinking about more democratic arrangements for that city regional level of governance. And an easy example to quote in making that argument would be Greater London. I'm not saying you want to have the same as London, but just to make the point that we've got a successful model in our country with a directly elected second tier of governance that's not thousands of councillors. There's 25 London members for a city of 8 million people. So you wouldn't be looking for a large number of councillors, really. I think you'd be looking for something relatively small, but they would be directly elected and visible. That would be where the thinking might want to go.
I think some people are thinking about the almost resurrecting the York County Council, whereby there will be quite a lot of members elected. But can I just continue with Robin, if you don't mind, about the involvement of the LEPs, because you haven't touched on that. And in the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, we do work closely and have a good relationship with the LEP. And I do know some other combined authorities try and keep them at a distance, which I think is a mistake. Can I have your opinion on that, please, Robin?
Well, I'm on your side straight off the bat. I think you do need to work closely with the LEP. I think I learned quite a bit about this when I was in Chicago. I think there's a bit of, how can I put it, social, cultural forces here. I think in Britain, and I speak about my own experience here a little bit, I say in local government back in the day, we did not work very closely with business. It wasn't seen as something needed to do. We had to deliver really good public services in local areas. I think in other countries, and certainly in the US, I think there was more of an understanding that the local economy matters for the quality of life place, so that businesses have been more involved in local government in the US historically than they have been in Britain. But I think what's happened in the last perhaps 15, 20 years up pretty fast, and I'm pleased to hear what you say about the way you are working with the lab. because you do want prosperous businesses in your area, and I think local government can help bring that about, and I think I can see us being much more effective across the country, really, in working with business. I think local offices perhaps need to learn a bit more about their wider social responsibilities, but the main point is you want them to prosper economically, and working closely with them is important. So I would emphasise that, and I would say, in a way, I think Britain's historically not been doing that, but has improved quite a lot. But as you say, not everywhere. I think in some places the LEP is viewed with suspicion, and that's probably not very helpful.
Thank you.
Just to sort of go back to that question, Robin, about public engagement, public knowledge about the direction of regional devolution and its implications for local democracy. One of the main criticisms have been is that the consultations undertaken by emerging combined authorities has been post hoc, has been rather porous in its range, and doesn't really have any ability to affect the outcomes of what's happening at the moment. Now, you mentioned in your presentation that in Portland and in other areas there was some good examples of these governmental structures engaging well with the wider public. I just wonder whether you might want to say a little bit more about what kind of examples there are and what lessons we could learn at Kirklees for engaging with citizens about strategic reform of governmental arrangements.
Right, yeah. That's a big question. There are probably quite a few levels on it, aren't there?
Apologies.
That's fine. One is to strengthen the representative structures, so that we've got the councillors in the room with us this morning, giving time and effort to represent different interests in the locality. Enormously important role, often undervalued, but supporting councillors, and this is a message back to the parties as well, isn't it, about trying to bring new talent into our political bodies. I really think that's so important, and I think we do support councillors up to a point, but I think I could make a case for giving more help to councillors, and I think that varies internationally. In some places there's more resources perhaps available for councillors to support councillors in their work than we have here. But I think you're speaking to what I would call the participatory democracy that needs to go alongside the representative democracy. These two ways of looking at democracy are not in tension. Sometimes people think, they're in conflict. I don't agree with that at all. Representatives are keen on participatory models and bringing different voices in. I think the Portland experience and that Portland Public Engagement Guide is one to have a look at. They've got a very long tradition of community activism in the city, so it helped the city region perhaps, but certainly the city. So that sort of helps them. There's a fairly active citizenry in the first place, but that aside, I think they've been quite good in, and some of this is on quite a lot is on the web, the Metro web. They actually give very clear and accessible advice to help community members engage with the Metro and with the staff who are serving the Metro, and also there's some federal involvement as well. So it's trying to demystify what this Metro is and making it very open, and I think these active citizens have picked up on that. So there's lots of public hearings, lots of debate. It's quite a lively politics in Portland. It's unusual in the US for being quite green. It's probably the greenest city in the US. They were on to eco-friendly policies a very long time ago. So the politics of the city help it a bit, I suppose. I'm trying to say it's not just the publication of a nice guide to help people, but I've been good. I think the officers working there are very good at working with their members and with community interests. And that's a very important lesson for public servants as well. And then perhaps the last thing that I don't know so much about, but I think you're looking at this, Andy, in the Commission, is the use of social media. I think there could be some quite interesting steps forward there. There's been hopes expressed about that before, and they've been a bit the outcomes have not been that great, but I think we have to keep going on that and see if we can improve the use of social media in local governance.
No, that's enormously helpful. I mean, we certainly will look at the guide. We certainly will look through that. Gemma, sorry.
No, sorry.
Oh, right. Just to sort of push that on further then, because one of the clear issues has been, you raised there, is about the idea of bringing through new councillors. How do we bring through the next generation, so to speak, of councillors? From your experiences looking at other international case studies, are there any examples there you could offer about how other combined authorities and local authorities are engaging and bringing through that next generation?
Right, that is a good question. It's a good one, and nothing springs straight away, so that suggests it's new territory, doesn't it, I think? I think you've got... I think a lot depends on the local politics of place. I think this is sort of quite encouraging. Different places can invent different ways of doing things, and that's healthy. In Auckland, just as a little example, I think this is quite good. You've got a very strong Maori community that's historic and has been neglected. So you've got a disadvantaged group that's an important part of society that's not being heard very well. So they did toy with the idea of having seats on the Auckland Council purely for Maori representatives, if you can imagine that. Sort of just, we've got to bring these people, and some of these are talking about younger Maori as well. They don't actually go that far, but they've created a board, I forget the name of it now, but it's like a Maori board that's got special status within the governance of the city, and it advises the mayor on any issues relating to Maori concerns. And it's Mayor Brown has decided to use that model with other groups. So young people, I think it might be elderly residents too, there are these boards of, call them communities of interest, who might not get represented through the geography elections very well, but need to be listened to. So that might be an avenue that could be looked at in Kirklees, where you might have one or two, I don't know what you want to call them, boards, but arrangements for, like say, young people to have a voice. Here in Bristol, maybe this is an example to think about. Mayor Ferguson introduced youth mayors, so the schools elected when he was, shortly after he was elected, 2 youth mayors, one boy, one girl from the schools, to actually be the youth mayors, and then that's then developing more into a kind of youth parliament. And those the young people in that role, I think they served for 1 year. They'd be sixth formers typically, and then they'd be getting experience, and obviously George and Marvin Rees is the same, is very strong on that, so they're given access to anything they want, attending meetings and also speaking at events. So I think there's quite a lot of new ideas here that could be tried out to reach groups who perhaps wouldn't normally get. Because you know the classic is the articulate and well-educated dominant debate, don't they? And some of the other voices get left out.
That's enormously helpful. I must admit my experience in New Zealand is that Auckland framework has transferred to the national parliament as well, so they tend to bring through a lot of younger representatives in the national parliament. Kirklees has maintained its youth council, which I think has been admirable.
You have a youth council,
yes.
do you?
Yeah, I think it's admirable.
Oh, great.
Yeah, considering the climate at the moment, that it's often a very easy cut to make. I really do commend them for it. But those are really helpful ideas. Eric?
Just on that line, perhaps in the not too distant future, perhaps we could have a combined authority youth parliament, and that'd be really interesting proposition to have. I'm glad when you started discussing councillors, you didn't start saying, well, we'll shoot councillors that have been on too long.
I wouldn't do that.
No. Well, thanks very much, Rob, because I think people that have been on a number of years, I think on councils you have to have a balance, I think, between young people, constantly refreshed, and people with experience. I think that does help with democracy in many ways. Because age is but a number, I'm sure you agree.
I do. I think that's right. You do need... I think it's probably true that most councils are skewed age-wise to older people, so we need to rebalance, but we don't need to lose all that experience. We need it.
We're very lucky in Kirklees, by the way. We've got quite a number of younger councillors from all parties. So in that way we go in down that direction that you speak about. Can I just go back to elected mayors?
Yes.
Please, if you don't mind. And about a veto of leaders, because in some areas an elected mayor can have, as we touched on earlier, too much power.
Yes.
And leaders of proposed combined authorities are a bit wary of the mayor having too much power, and they are demanding vetoes in certain areas. What do you think about that, Robin?
Well, I think this is all up for discussion in particular places, and the easy answer is I think you should design, I say you collectively, an arrangement that suits your situation.
So one size doesn't fit all?
Absolutely, no. I think you can have the argument. I think you can have a good debate really about you want the mayor, if you're going to have a mayor, to be effective. So you don't want to impose so many constraints on what the individual mayor can do that they're hamstrung and they can't really lead much and they can't really push things along. So you need to be careful you don't have too many checks and balances. But on the other hand, you certainly don't want a situation where you can't control the directly elected mayor at all. And I don't want to criticise George Ferguson particularly. I mean, Mayor Ferguson made a lot of things different in Bristol that are now helping Marvin Rees and the new councillors. So it was because I think we needed a bit of a shake-up. But I do think he did really not pay attention enough to his councillors, so that they then became voices against him. And it might even explain why he did not get re-elected in May, because he wanted to be elected for a second term. But he hadn't won any friends with the councillors because he didn't value their role. And in the constitution of the council, as it was under the Localism Act, he didn't actually have to. He did have to go to council meetings and he was held to account in a formal way, but he didn't really have to listen too much if he didn't want to. And he didn't at times, and that created some conflicts that we perhaps could have done without. So that's the long way of saying, do have a careful think through about the areas of responsibility you feel the mayor should be able to exercise on your behalf without undue constraint, but be sure about the council of voice. The president of Portland Metro might be a model to look at there. This is not a directly elected mayor, but the president is a really powerful figure in Portland, very highly respected, but works collegially. And in the end, there's a vote. I think there are 5 councillors, maybe 6. And those, I think it's 6, so you have those 7 individuals. The mayor can't overrule the other 6. There's got to be an agreement. The president can't overrule. So I think have a little think about what suits the local context. And I think a very strong directly elected mayor with major executive power might not be the right model for your part of the world, from what you're saying.
Because we had something similar to what you described, not too far away, in Doncaster. You would probably remember that.
Oh gosh, yeah, I've forgotten you. That wasn't a happy experience, I don't think, was it?
None at all. Yeah, he was at loggerheads with I think just about every councillor that sat on the authority.
Yeah.
And took not a blind bit of notice of anyone.
Right. Yeah, I've forgotten that, but you're quite right. That is a very good example of how to get it wrong, I think.
Yeah. I think in some senses that was the personality of the mayor came into play there, I think.
Yes, he was. I met him a few times. He was curmudgeonly old. Anyway, I better not.
But that plays into the personality stuff, doesn't it? That you somebody who you think might do doesn't have their own skills.
Yeah.
Right, I just want to move things on slightly, because one of the interesting things that you raised in your presentation with reference to Stuttgart was the fact that they are using a proportional representative electoral system.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we are looking at is not only election cycles, which you've already made some very helpful comments on, but also other initiatives to try and encourage greater public engagement with local democracy and hopefully through that increased turnout of elections. And I wonder whether you'd like to say a few words about the experience of the effect of PR on the Stuttgart Council and any other initiatives you're aware of where local authorities or combined authorities have engaged in political reform, electoral reform, to try and increase engagement and participation.
Right, yeah. Well, we've got quite a lot of use of proportional representation in local government, well, in central and local governments in continental Europe, and there are different models and different experiences, so it's probably a bit don't want to be too sweeping about saying, oh, it's a definite plus or a definite backward step. I think you have to look at each model. I think in the voter turnout for the Stuttgart city region, I think it was about 53% in their elections. So that's, you could say, good, because it's better than we tend to get in local government elections in England. But it's actually, 53 is quite a bit lower than you get in Scandinavia, where they all, well, it varies again, but in Sweden you have proportional representation. I did some work with, this might make you, might raise a chuckle here. This is in Malmö in Sweden. I think of it as being the Liverpool of Sweden. If you go back, it's the big port that the dockyard industries have gone now, and it's reinvented itself as a service sector city, a multi-ethnic city now. But they were worried in Malmö, this is not that long ago, because voter turnout dropped below 70%. Different from in England. So up 80%, that would probably they'd expect, and it's dropped to 70%. So they're worried about voter turnout there because of that. That's not just PR, by the way. The powers of local government in Sweden are probably the greatest powers of any local government in the world. They do have enormous power at the local level. So they run all the Kirklees services and the health service in elected local government. So they have local income tax, and very few Swedes pay any income tax to central government. It's paid to the local level. So if you're looking for models of real devolved power, Sweden might be a place to look. I mean, that would be quite a long step from where we are in England, I think. So I think the PR plays into that, and it does allow voices to get elected that would not get through on the first past the post system. You know, the classic argument for PR is you do have a wider range of voices in the elected assembly.
We just explore that a little bit, Robin, because one of the things I've tried to do in the past is find out where income tax, vehicle excise duty, VAT goes that's collected in Yorkshire. It's very difficult to find that out at a local level. If you think about personally, I mean, my share of our council tax is about £500-600. I pay several, thousands of pounds in income tax every year. I've got a lot more control over the few £100 than they have over the £1,000. So
absolutely, yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
And again, going back to what you're talking about, business engagement. Historically, there was very little incentive other than civic good about promoting business locally, because all of the benefit from business rates went directly to central government. So so that model of actually local people having control over the taxes that are collected locally. Is there any other places other than Sweden? Sorry.
I think the line broke up a bit there, Andy, but can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Just one, we'll not be drawing to a close in a minute, but just one thought. I'm just listening to the discussion. I think the scale of the public spending cuts that are hitting local government across England, and obviously Kirklees as bad as anywhere else, I think it's worth trying to get the word out about the scale of those cuts more effectively. I'm not criticising Kirklees here. I think across the country, but I got some figures. Finance people in Bristol helped me, and I think this is probably true everywhere. Just to give you a couple of figures. This is central government's financial support to Bristol City Council. In 2011, that year, it was 201 million. That was the total central government support. In 2019, this is 10 years later, it will be 45 million. So it's going from 201 million to 40 million in 10 years. That's a 78% cut. So I think that's probably happening to you as well.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely devastating. So it means you're having to fire people, I think, or make people redundant. There may be ways of doing it, but you are going to have to stop providing some important services. So that as we talk about devolution and whether these Devo deals are strengthening local government, I think it's always worth looking at, well, what about these public spending cuts that are really damaging local public services? I think the Commission needs to at least pay some attention to that context, don't you?
There certainly is something about that. Obviously, there is careful consideration of the political dynamics of such debates, but I think that one of the things that we are very certain on is that there is a correlation between government cutbacks on local government spending and its impact on local democracy. As local government becomes less resonant in people's life, then they're less likely to possibly engage politically as well. But certainly,
I think that's a good answer. I was just thinking about joining the council relatively recently. I mean, it's great that we've got new people willing to stand, but in a way, the scope for Gemma to do what some of her more senior friends around the table were able to do is a lot less because of the public spending cuts. So you can imagine why some local potential candidates decide, I don't think I will stand for council because the constraints on what we can do is so strong. I'm not sure it's a good use of my time. So I think that's a key issue I think it's a key issue for the Commission, actually. Also, it needs to be included, I think.
well, thank you, mate. It's a very interesting point to make, and we will certainly take that on. I am looking at the time, and I'm aware that we are coming to the end of our time. Just to sort of conclude, are we?
Yes, I'd like to thank Robin too. It's been excellent having this conversation, Robin.
I've enjoyed it too. It's been really good. Excellent. No.
And thank you for raising that point in a non-political way, because I think you're quite right. It does need to be included.
Yeah, it's not a political point. It's about public services on the screen.
It's factual, isn't it?
I think that's very much big. Just to sort of give you an outline of what we're doing from now on, Robin, the Commission's going to carry on taking evidence until the end of October in one form or another. We then are going to go away and, as a group, the Commissioners and the officers are going to consider the evidence that we've taken and draw up some conclusions. And a draft report will be then available. Now, what we're very keen to ensure is that sometimes these commissions tend to come and extract information from people such as yourself that are very kind to give you your time, but then often don't come back and have a second engagement about our conclusions before we go on and publish. We're very keen to make sure that doesn't happen, and what we're wanting to do with anyone that's given the time to spend with us and give their thoughts is to reconnect and re-engage when we get to that draft report stage. And we'd be very, very grateful if you might consider offering some thoughts on our initial recommendations before we finally go to publish the report itself.
Yeah, no, that will be fine, Andy. No problem on that. But it also occurs to me you might want to have, maybe you've got this in plan, when might need some sort of event or launch event or public occasion when the findings are publicised more widely. And
we certainly will. And one of the things
you've got some action lines on. But that's the sort of thing that if I could get it into my diary, I'd be interested to come up for if there was an event of that kind.
Oh, that's very kind. That's enormously kind.
Something to think about, anyway.
No, we will certainly take you up on that. That's a very kind offer. And one of the things that's been really rewarding is that the LGA has got behind this initiative as well, and that we have had, a wide a widespread support from stakeholders across local and national government, and we intend to make sure that we disseminate our report as widely as we can. And knowing your own networks and contacts, would be enormously grateful if you could help us in that work.
Okay, well, if I could just say once again, congratulations on getting the commission up and running and the work you're doing, and I wish you well with it, and I think you're going about this in a very effective way.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. That's very kind of you to say. Well, thank you very much for a very enjoyable and very lively and very engaging conversation this morning, Robin, and we shall, as I say, we shall be in touch in due course.
Right, okay, no problem.
Take care.